You think you can talk to me? You're nothing but a damn animal! Ugh. I'm the man who's gonna make you pay!
Sit down. Now. You're not going anywhere. Get your hands off me, you're hurting me.
You piece of garbage! Get away from me!
Oh my God! Stop! You're going down!
No! Get off! You think you belong here?
Stop!
Not on my watch. Keep your distance, man. Don't you dare tell me what to do. Watch it! You asked for this. You're gonna regret that.
I demand to know why I have to sit next to this man. Get him away from me!
Sir, please calm down.
Leave him alone!
Boots. Get up. That seat belongs to a paying customer. The words cracked through the cabin like a slap. Not loud exactly, worse than loud. Boots. Certain, final. The kind of voice that had never once been told no, and did not plan on hearing it today. Boots. Bradford Kane did not ask. He did not tap the overhead bin or catch the flight attendant's eye first. He simply stood in the aisle of Meridian Air Flight 447. His charcoal suit cut so sharp it looked like it could draw blood. His gold watch turned face out on his wrist so the whole cabin could see the time he thought only he was allowed to keep. Boots, and he pointed. One finger aimed at the man in seat 2A like a verdict already reached. The man in 2A did not move. Boots. He wore a plain gray hoodie, the kind that's been through so many washes the color stopped being a color and became more of a memory. Boots. Dark joggers, white sneakers, no logo. Noise-canceling headphones sat over his ears, eyes closed, hands flat on the armrests with the particular stillness of a man who had been still on purpose for a long time, because stillness was armor he'd built himself. Boots. Bradford waited 3 seconds. 4, 5. Around them, first class had already gone quiet in that specific way a room goes quiet when everyone senses something and nobody wants to be first to react. Boots. A woman lowered her magazine an inch. A man by the window stopped scrolling but didn't put the phone down. Boots. A young woman 2 rows back looked up from her screen and did not look away again. Nobody said a word. Boots. And in that silence, Bradford Kane made a decision that would end his career before the plane ever left the ground. Boots. What Bradford didn't know, what none of them knew, not the lead flight attendant already sizing up, who looked like money, not the security officer who'd be summoned in under 10 minutes, not the co-pilot who'd authorize a removal, without ever stepping out of the cockpit to check who he was removing, was the identity of the man sitting quietly in seat 2A. Boots. His name was Elijah Cross, and in exactly 16 minutes, Elijah Cross would make one phone call that would turn this airplane around, roll it back to the gate, and end Bradford Kane's career before the wheels ever touched a runway. Boots. But that wasn't even the biggest part. The biggest part was this. Elijah Cross wasn't just a passenger. He was the man flying to Chicago to sign a $4.6 billion rescue deal, an agreement that would decide whether this very airline still existed by the end of the year. Boots. He held the signature that stood between Meridian Air and total collapse. He was managing partner of Ironbridge Capital, one of the most powerful private investment firms in the country. Boots. And every person walking this aisle, from the captain locked behind a steel door to the flight attendant reaching for the intercom button, was, in the most literal way possible, about to humiliate the one man coming to save their jobs. Boots. They didn't know that. They looked at the hoodie. They looked at his skin. They looked at his silence, and they decided. Boots. It would be the most expensive decision any of them ever made. Some mistakes cost you an awkward apology, and a coupon email 3 days later with a subject line like "We take this seriously." Boots. Some mistakes cost you nothing at all because nobody was watching. Boots. But some mistakes happen in full view of a phone that's already recording, in earshot of a reporter who happens to be sitting 2 rows back, in front of a cabin full of strangers who will remember your face for the rest of their lives, and are aimed directly at the one person holding your entire company's future in his hands. Boots. Those mistakes cost everything. This is the story of one flight, one seat, one man who chose to stay perfectly, deliberately, dangerously still, and what happened when the world finally caught up to who he really was. Boots. Stay with me, because the ending of this one is going to hit harder than you expect. Elijah Cross had boarded Flight 447 nearly an hour before Bradford Kane even walked into the terminal. Boots. He'd come through priority boarding, not because he needed the speed, but because it was the lane his ticket entitled him to. and Elijah Cross had long ago decided he would never again apologize for using what he'd already paid for. Boots. He carried one bag, worn brown leather, the stitching starting to give at one corner from being shoved into 100 overhead bins across a dozen countries. Boots. He never checked luggage. Checked bags were for people who had time to wait around a carousel, and Elijah didn't have that kind of time, hadn't had it in years. Boots. He'd nodded once at the gate agent, a young woman who smiled back at him without doing any math in her head. Boots. Just smiled because that's what the moment called for. In seat 2A, he settled in with the ease of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. Boots. Bag overhead, belt across the lap. Headphones from the side pocket placed over his ears with care, eyes closed before the next row of passengers even started boarding. Boots. From the outside, he looked like a man who wanted to disappear. He hadn't chosen to disappear. He'd chosen to rest. Boots. There's a difference, one most people in that cabin wouldn't have been able to name, but Elijah understood it with the precision of someone who'd spent 22 years learning rooms that weren't built with him in mind. Boots. Disappearing is surrender. Resting is strategy. You slow your breathing. You let the world keep doing whatever the world's going to do. Boots. You save the energy for later. For the lawyers across the table, for the room full of people looking for a reason to doubt your numbers, for the meeting in Chicago that would require him to be the sharpest man in the building, which, based on 20 years of history, he usually was. Boots. In the pocket of his hoodie, his phone sat dark but unlocked. On the screen, a 51-page draft agreement between Ironbridge Capital and Meridian Air, marked up in his own handwriting in the margins. Boots. 2 clauses still needed final language from legal. One paragraph on page 34 he'd rewritten 5 times and still wasn't happy with. Boots. He hadn't slept in 29 hours. Back-to-back meetings in Dallas. Before that, a red-eye from Seattle, where he'd spent 3 days buried in due diligence that ended at 1A. Boots. M. And started again at 6. Before that, a weekend in Miami that was supposed to be a break and lasted about 7 hours before his assistant, Priya Malhotra, called with something that couldn't wait. Boots. Elijah Cross was, by any measure that mattered, one of the most powerful financial minds in the country. His firm had restructured 14 companies in 6 years. Boots. He'd been profiled in 3 business magazines. He'd sat in boardrooms in Tokyo, Zurich, Lagos, Sao Paulo, and in every single one of them, he was the man who walked in knowing the most and walked out having said the least. Boots. He wore a faded hoodie and sneakers with no logo. That wasn't an accident. It wasn't even humility exactly, though Elijah Cross was capable of plenty of that. Boots. It was something sharper, a refusal. A deliberate decision to stop performing wealth for strangers who needed convincing. He had the real thing. Boots. He didn't need the costume. He'd learned a long time ago that the people who mattered already knew exactly who he was. Boots. The rest were about to find out. Bradford Kane announced himself before he even finished walking through the cabin door. Not with words, though words were coming, but with the unmistakable energy of a man who had never once questioned whether a room was built for him. Boots. He moved the way certain men move after 15 years of walking into first class like it's a formality, not checking seat numbers. Boots. Not glancing around. Just moving, assuming the space would rearrange itself for him. He was 56. The suit was tailored, the kind of stitching that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Boots. Silver at the temples, dark through the middle, hair set in place with something that seemed to defy weather, gravity, and consequence in equal measure. Boots. On his left wrist, a watch with a gold bezel worn face out. Not the way people wear watches to check the time, but the way people wear watches to make sure you notice they have one. Boots. Behind him walked Yasmin Reyes, 29, carrying a leather tote and the careful, practiced blankness of someone whose job required her to agree with almost everything and pretend not to notice the rest. Boots. She'd been his assistant for 2 years. She was good at it. She was also in the specific way people can be good at a job while it slowly corrodes something in them, exhausted by it. Boots. Bradford was on the phone when he boarded. He hadn't hung up for the jet bridge, hadn't hung up for the ID check, hadn't hung up to hand his bag to the attendant. Boots. He was talking about the Chicago deal, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. We've got the numbers locked. Boots. Tomorrow this time, everything changes. Trust me, they need us more than we need them. None of it was accurate. Boots. All of it was loud. He checked his boarding pass. Seat 2A, he looked up. There was a man in seat 2A. Boots. Bradford stopped moving, just for a second. Something crossed his face, confusion, maybe, or the beginning of a question he hadn't decided how to ask yet. Boots. Then the moment passed, replaced by the expression that had become his default over 5 decades of getting what he wanted in most rooms he walked into. Absolute certainty that this would resolve in his favor. Boots. He ended the call, looked at Yasmin. She looked at the man in the hoodie, then back at Bradford, and her face did exactly what it had been trained to do. Boots. Nothing. Bradford tapped the man's arm. Hey, nothing. Hey, buddy, you're in my seat. The man in 2A opened his eyes. Boots. He looked at Bradford with the unhurried attention of someone who has all the time in the world and has decided to spend a little of it on you. Boots. Dark eyes, still face, not angry, not scrambling. He looked at Bradford the way you'd look at weather, a fact, not a judgment. Boots. Then he glanced at the seat number stamped above the window, 2A. He looked down at the boarding pass resting in his lap. Boots. 2A. He set the pass back down. He closed his eyes. He did not move. Bradford blinked. This wasn't how this went. Boots. This was never how it went. When Bradford Kane wanted something to happen, it happened. He had built an entire life on the reliable machinery of other people folding. And right now the machinery had jammed, and he was staring at a man in a hoodie who had simply shut his eyes again. Boots, I said. And his voice picked up a new edge now, somewhere between insistence and warning. You're in my seat. Boots. The man didn't open his eyes. Yasmin shifted the tote on her shoulder. She looked at the back of Bradford's neck. Boots. She looked at the man in the hoodie. She thought about saying something. She looked out the window instead, at the gray tarmac, at the baggage carts crawling by in slow lines, at anything that wasn't this. Boots. Are you serious right now? Bradford said, to no one, to the cabin, to the universe, that had apparently decided to introduce friction into his Tuesday. Boots. From the first 3 rows, passengers were watching without watching. A young woman with a camera bag stepped her laptop aside. Boots. A man in a gray blazer 2 rows back went very still. Nobody spoke. And then Renata Ford walked out of the forward galley, and the worst night of several careers quietly began. Boots. Renata Ford had been a flight attendant for 17 years, and she could read a first-class cabin the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Fast, clinical, a diagnosis forming before she'd even seen the whole picture. Boots. 44, sharp-featured, immaculately put together, with the posture of a woman who'd been told early in her career that authority lives in the spine, and never forgot it. Boots. She came out of the galley with a smile already assembled, the professional kind, symmetrical, warm from a distance, and made of something other than warmth up close. Boots. She looked at Bradford. She looked at the man in seat 2A. The calculation took less than 2 seconds, and it wasn't a decision she made slowly or with hesitation. It had happened so many times over so many years that it no longer felt like a choice. Boots. It felt like clarity, like simply seeing one man in a tailored suit and a gold watch, radiating the particular entitlement of someone who complained to corporate and got results. Boots. One man in a faded hoodie with his eyes shut. She turned the smile on Bradford. Is there a problem, sir? Boots. There absolutely is. Relief flooded his voice. Finally, someone with authority. This individual, the word landed with weight, is sitting in my seat. Boots. I'm a Meridian Platinum member. I fly this route every single week. I specifically requested this seat for the workspace. Boots. I need this handled. Renata turned to the man in the hoodie. The smile cooled by exactly 3 degrees. Sir, may I see your boarding pass? Boots. He opened his eyes. He didn't rush. He reached into his hoodie pocket, pulled out a slightly creased printed pass, and held it out. Boots. Renata took it, looked at it. Meridian Air, Flight 447, Seat 2A, today's date. The name Elijah Cross. She turned it over, as if the light might reveal something the front hadn't. Boots. She typed something into her tablet, looked at the screen, looked at the pass again. The ticket was valid. Anyone could see the ticket was valid. Boots. His ticket's valid, she said, and the faint upward lilt in her voice, the sound of a result that had disappointed her, told everyone in earshot exactly what kind of decision she was about to make anyway. Boots. She handed the pass back. She didn't leave, Mr. Cross. The name landed carefully, precisely, with just enough care to suggest she'd already decided the name wasn't really the point. Boots. We do have a very comfortable seat open in business class. Window seat, extra legroom. After a long trip, it might honestly be more restful than... Boots. No. One word. Flat, quiet, absolute. Renata blinked. Behind her, Bradford made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a scoff, but had elements of both. Boots. Yasmin stared at the carpet. And 2 rows back, a young woman with a camera bag opened her phone's camera app, angled the lens toward the front of the cabin, and quietly, without a word, pressed record. Boots. Bradford Kane had never learned to accept no gracefully. He'd heard it so rarely in his life that it had never lost its quality of insult. It landed not as information but as a personal attack, as though whoever said it had failed to understand exactly who they were talking to. Boots. He stepped sideways in the aisle, angling his body so his complaint was visible to the widest possible slice of the cabin. Boots. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was instinct, the instinct of a man who'd learned that public witnesses were leverage. Boots. You know what your problem is? Voice relaxed into something almost casual, the register of a man explaining something obvious to someone he found mildly tedious. Boots. You dress like this to look humble, like you're above appearances, a pause built for effect, but all it really does is confirm what the rest of us already figured. Boots. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The cabin had already heard where it was going. The woman in row 3 set her magazine down completely. Boots. The man in the gray blazer, Desmond Achibi, a freelance journalist with a journalist's involuntary habit of cataloging everything around him, stopped pretending to look at his phone. Boots. Elijah Cross said nothing. He sat with his hands flat on the armrests, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the galley curtain. Boots. His face showed nothing. Not suppressed anger, not a tight jaw, not the visible effort of someone swallowing a reaction. Boots. Something more deliberate than that. Something practiced. He had learned, the hard way, the only way that lesson ever fully lands, that the most powerful response to contempt wasn't anger. Boots. Wasn't argument. Wasn't the very human, very understandable urge to stand up and explain exactly who you were to people who'd already decided they knew. Boots. The most powerful response was silence and patience, and the certainty that the truth would arrive exactly when it needed to, on its own schedule, without his help. Boots. So he said nothing. He waited. Bradford turned to Renata like a man who'd made his case and was waiting on the verdict. Boots. Renata. He's refusing to cooperate. I want this handled before we push back. Renata's smile hadn't moved, but her eyes had taken on the look of someone recalculating risk. Boots. Of course, Mr. Kane, I'm recording this. The voice came from row 3, not loud, not shaking, just clear. Boots. Selena Ruiz was 28. She had close to 1 million followers on a travel platform she'd built from nothing over 4 years, posting from airport terminals and hostels and the backs of vans on roads that didn't show up on maps. Boots. She'd saved for months to afford this business-class seat, planning a review video of Meridian's transatlantic service. She hadn't planned to use the camera for this. Boots. But she'd been watching for the last several minutes, and she'd seen a man sit quietly in a seat he clearly owned and get treated like an interruption. Boots. She'd watched a flight attendant hand back a valid boarding pass and immediately go looking for a workaround. She pressed record. Boots. I'm live streaming, Selena said, her voice carrying easily through the first few rows. Everything happening in this cabin, starting right now, is going out to my audience in real time. Boots. Renata turned, the smile recalibrating instantly. Miss, this is a private aircraft. You don't have the right. I'm a passenger, Selena said. Boots. I'm not interfering with anything. I'm sitting in my seat. She angled the phone so the frame caught Renata, caught Bradford, caught the man in seat 2A, sitting perfectly still. Boots. Just documenting. She typed a caption with her free hand. On board Meridian Air right now. A black man is being pressured out of a seat he clearly paid for because another passenger doesn't like where he's sitting. Boots. This is happening live. The viewer count read 12, then 31, then 89. Desmond Achibi folded his newspaper. 39 years old, 11 years as a freelance journalist, and over that time he'd developed a kind of professional reflex, a low hum in the back of his skull that fired whenever he was near a story. Boots. It had been buzzing quietly for the last several minutes. Now it was wide awake. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket, uncapped a pen, and started writing. Boots. Renata disappeared into the forward galley for almost 2 minutes. When she came back, her posture had changed. Boots. The warmth in her face, already thin, had been replaced by something more official. The particular bearing of someone who'd checked with someone above her and come back with permission to do something, she couldn't have justified on her own. Boots. She'd spoken to the co-pilot, Marcus Delgado, sealed in the cockpit with Captain Whitfield. She'd described the situation in the specific bloodless language crews learn to use when they want a result without saying the quiet part out loud. Boots. Passenger in 2A creating a disturbance. Platinum member requesting the seat. Requesting authorization to escalate. Marcus Delgado hadn't asked who the passenger was. Boots. Hadn't asked what the disturbance actually consisted of. He'd said, handle it. Get us pushed back on time. Renata came back with authorization. Boots. She walked to seat 2A and stood over Elijah with the body language of someone now operating under sanctioned orders. Boots. She reached past him, a deliberate overstep, not touching him but entering his space uninvited, and picked up the boarding pass resting on the seat edge beside him. Boots. I'm going to hold on to this while we sort this out, she said. Elijah looked at the hand that had just taken his boarding pass. Boots. Then at her face. That's not yours to hold, he said. His voice was so level it barely had a temperature. Boots. Give it back. Once the seating situation is resolved. It's resolved. I'm in my seat. The seat printed on the pass in your pocket. Boots. Give it back. Renata held eye contact for 2 seconds that felt considerably longer than 2 seconds. Then she tucked the boarding pass into her jacket pocket and reached for the intercom panel on the bulkhead. Boots. The PA clicked on. Her voice went out to every row. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the brief delay this evening. Boots. We are currently resolving a seating discrepancy in the forward cabin. We appreciate your patience and expect to have this settled shortly. Boots. Thank you. She clicked off. The silence that followed had a different weight than the silence before it. The first silence had been people choosing not to react. Boots. This one was the silence of people who had just heard, over an official channel from a uniformed crew member, that the man in seat 2A was a problem. Boots. A discrepancy. That the aircraft could not move until something about him was resolved. Boots. Every head in the forward cabin turned toward row 2. Not because everyone had made Renata's calculation, but because an announcement over a plane's PA carries a specific kind of authority, and it takes real clarity or real experience with how wrong those official voices can be to hear one and stay skeptical. Boots. A few people stayed skeptical anyway. Selena adjusted her camera angle. Viewer count 340. She typed, "They just made a PA announcement calling this man a discrepancy." Boots. He is sitting in complete silence in his seat. Desmond wrote down the exact wording of the announcement, the time, and a single bracketed note. Tone. Punitive. Boots. Frames passenger as the problem, not crew. Standing near the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the cabin was Camille Duarte, 25, 2 years into the job, with a face that hadn't yet learned Renata's professional mask. Boots. Right now her face was showing something plain and specific. She was watching this happen, and she wasn't okay with it. Boots. She'd checked Elijah Cross's boarding pass herself at the door, scanned it, registered the name, confirmed the seat. She remembered it specifically because she'd smiled and said, "Welcome aboard," and he'd said, "Thank you." 2 words, nothing worth cataloging, except most passengers didn't bother saying it back, and he had. Boots. His ticket was valid. She knew his ticket was valid. She looked at Renata, standing at the bulkhead, like someone waiting on a result she'd already set in motion. Boots. She looked at Bradford Kane in the aisle, arms crossed, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd pressed a button and was waiting for the machine to deliver. Boots. She looked at Elijah Cross, who hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't said a single word since his boarding pass left his hand. Boots. She stepped forward. Then Renata looked at her. Not a long look. Not, in any technical sense, threatening. Just a look that communicated with the efficiency that comes from years of knowing exactly where everyone sits in a hierarchy, that Camille should return to whatever she'd been doing before. Boots. Camille stopped. She stood at the curtain's edge, hands folded, jaw working, doing the thing faces do when they're trying to look neutral and failing. Boots. In seat 2A, Elijah Cross sat with perfect stillness. His boarding pass was gone. An announcement had just told an entire aircraft he was a problem. Boots. He reached into his hoodie pocket with one hand. His fingers found the smooth glass of his phone. He didn't take it out yet. Boots. He was thinking about a number. 16 minutes, the story would later say. But Elijah was counting down from something smaller. Boots. 3. He needed 3 more minutes. He needed to give this exactly enough rope. Because when the call came, and it was coming, there could be no ambiguity left, no room for the airline to release a statement about a misunderstanding that got resolved before departure. Boots. He needed witnesses, documentation, the entire architecture of what was happening, standing in plain sight, where nobody could later pretend they hadn't seen it. Boots. 3 more minutes. He put his hands back on the armrests. He waited. Bradford had been patient for roughly 4 minutes, which for Bradford Kane was about 4 minutes longer than he was used to waiting for anything. Boots. He stepped closer to Renata, dropping his voice into the register of a man sharing a confidence, while being fully aware everyone nearby could hear every word of it. Boots. Renata, I need you to understand something. I have a board meeting in Chicago tomorrow morning that decides the future of a company with 4,000 employees. Boots. I fly this route 40 times a year. I am your airline's most reliable revenue in this cabin. He paused. Boots. And I do not feel safe. The word safe went into the air and did exactly what it was built to do. Boots. Elijah hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't turned his head, hadn't shifted his shoulders by a single degree. He was, by any observable measure, the least threatening presence in the entire forward cabin. Boots. But the word safe didn't need evidence. It only needed to be said, and in the language of airline protocol, that word carried weight enough to move things on its own. Boots. Renata reached for her radio. I'll need to call for additional support. It took 4 minutes for Grant Holloway to appear at the cabin door. Boots. 34, broad-shouldered, dark uniform of a private security contractor, buzz cut. The manner of a man who processed every situation through one variable, compliant, or in need of adjustment. Boots. He came down the aisle without hurrying, without glancing at the rows around him, without pausing to gather context. He saw Renata. Boots. He saw Bradford. He saw the man in the hoodie in 2A. He made the same calculation everyone before him had made, and arrived at the same answer. Boots. Sir. He stopped at the end of the row. You're going to need to gather your things. From the galley curtain, Camille watched him walk past her without a glance. Boots. Watched him plant himself at the end of row 2. Watched Renata nod at him the way you nod at a service you called and are relieved to see arrive. Boots. And Camille stepped forward again. His boarding pass is valid. Her voice wasn't loud, but the cabin was quiet enough now that it carried clean to every row in range, which was every row in first class. Boots. Renata turned. Camille. I scanned it myself when he boarded. Camille's hands came together in front of her, fingers laced tight enough to whiten the knuckles. Boots. His name is on the manifest. His seat is 2A. The ticket is completely valid, and I checked it at the door. Boots. We cannot ask him to move. The cabin absorbed this with the specific attention of an audience that has been waiting for someone to finally say the obvious thing out loud. Boots. Grant looked at Renata. Renata looked at Camille with an expression that wasn't quite anger, closer to the look of someone hitting a complication she hadn't planned for, and didn't have time to handle politely. Boots. Camille returned to the galley. His ticket is valid. Camille. The word had the weight of a period, not a comma. Boots, now. Camille held her ground for 2 full seconds. She looked at Elijah, who was watching all of this from the center of it, with the expression of someone taking careful, permanent notes. Boots. Then she looked back at Renata, and she didn't move. From row 2, Desmond set down his pen and picked up his phone instead. Boots. He hadn't pointed it at the scene the way Selena had. He opened a search bar. He'd caught a glimpse of the boarding pass in Renata's hand before it disappeared into her pocket. Boots. Good eyes, and a trained habit of reading text in his peripheral vision. The name had registered even though he hadn't thought much of it in the moment. Boots. Elijah Cross. He typed it into the search bar. The results loaded in under a second. Desmond stopped scrolling, looked up from the phone at the man sitting quietly in 2A. Boots. Looked back down. Looked up again. The specific look of a journalist realizing the story in front of him is a great deal larger than the story he thought he'd wandered into. Boots. He turned to the woman across the aisle, who'd been watching the whole thing with the face of someone deeply uncomfortable and not yet sure what to do about it. Boots. Do you know who that is? He asked quietly. She shook her head. He said nothing else. He opened his notes app and started typing fast. Boots. At the galley edge, Camille still hadn't moved, and the fact that she hadn't had created its own small, specific tension. The tension of someone whose stillness had become its own statement. Boots. Bradford, watching this with dwindling patience, turned to Renata. Can you not manage your own staff? She doesn't speak for the airline, Renata said. Boots. Grant. Grant took a step toward the row. One more time, sir. Gather your things and come with me. Elijah looked at Grant. Boots. Looked at the hand hanging at his side. Not raised yet, not extended, but present the way a threat is present right before it becomes an action. Boots. I want to ask you a question, Elijah said. His voice was almost conversational, disturbingly conversational. Has anyone in this cabin given you the actual name on the boarding pass that woman put in her pocket? Boots. Grant blinked. Sir, has anyone told you why, specifically, I'm being asked to move? Not the policy line, the actual reason. Boots. Grant glanced at Renata. Renata didn't look back at him. Has anyone told you the actual reason? Elijah repeated, gentle and unbearable. Boots. Or were you just handed a description and told to handle it? The cabin was so quiet the air recycling system was audible. Boots. In seat 2C, Walter Higgins put down the aviation magazine he'd been holding. 57, white beard trimmed close, the slightly weathered look of a man who'd been flying long haul for 3 decades. Boots. He'd been watching since Bradford first opened his mouth, doing the private, uncomfortable math that people do when they see something wrong, and haven't yet decided what that recognition requires of them. Boots. He hadn't decided, but he'd put the magazine down. Selena's viewer count, 2,100. Desmond's notes, 7 paragraphs, 1 name circled 3 times. Boots. And Elijah Cross, sitting in 2A with no boarding pass, a security contractor at his elbow, and an entire aircraft that had just been told over the loudspeaker he was the problem, completely, unshakably still. Boots. He had been in this shape before, not this exact configuration, not this plane, not this crew, but the shape of it. Boots. The shape of being exactly where you belonged, and having to survive other people's certainty that you weren't. He'd been waiting 17 years for the chance to answer it properly. Boots. Not yet. One more step. Grant Holloway made his decision. 6 years on the job had given him a working theory about resistant passengers. The ones who talked back were manageable. Boots. The ones who went silent were either the easiest or the hardest, and you couldn't always tell which until you moved. Boots. He was a man who resolved uncertainty through action. Sitting still and asking questions wasn't in his instinct set. He put his hand on Elijah's shoulder. Boots. Not brutal, not a shove. Firm, the kind of grip that expects to produce movement. Palm down pressing. Get up. Boots. Elijah did not get up. He looked down at the hand, then up at Grant with an expression so specific and so controlled that Grant, without fully understanding why, felt the urge to step back. Boots. Remove your hand, Elijah said. 3 words. No pitch change, no tremor, no heat. Just 3 words, delivered like an opportunity being offered exactly once. Boots. Grant didn't remove it. You're making this harder than it has to be. On your feet. From the back of the row, where Bradford had been watching with the satisfaction of a man whose problem was being solved by proxy, came 4 words. Boots. Just drag him out. The words went into the cabin and stayed there. There was nowhere for them to echo in the soft, furnished quiet of first class, but they landed with the permanence certain phrases acquire when they're said out loud in front of witnesses. Boots. Selena's phone was pointed directly at Bradford when he said it. Her microphone caught it clean. Desmond wrote it down verbatim, quotation marks and all. The way journalists mark down something they know they'll need to be precise about later. Boots. 200 miles away, on the ground, Priya Malhotra sat at her desk with Elijah's calendar open on one screen and his secure messaging channel open on the other, already watching Selena's stream on her phone, because she had alerts set up for exactly this kind of thing. Boots. She was watching. She was ready. In the cabin, Camille had heard Bradford's 4 words. Boots. She walked out from the galley threshold a second time, past Renata, who snapped her name in a tone that was both warning and threat, past Grant, whose hand was still on a seated passenger's shoulder, apparently without registering what that looked like from 6 feet away. Boots. She planted herself at the end of row 2 and spoke with a steadiness that surprised even her. You are not authorized to physically remove a passenger without a direct order from the captain of this aircraft. Boots. Not the co-pilot, the captain. She turned to Grant. Have you spoken to Captain Whitfield? Grant's grip loosened by a fraction, muscle memory answering a procedural challenge before his conscious mind caught up. Boots. The co-pilot authorized, the co-pilot, Camille said, does not have removal authority over a seated, non-disruptive passenger. That's Meridian Protocol, Section 7. Boots. Where is Captain Whitfield? Nobody answered. Because Captain Whitfield was sealed in the cockpit and hadn't been briefed on anything that happened in the last 11 minutes. Boots. He knew there was a delay. He didn't know why. He'd trusted his crew, which was generally the right instinct, and in this case was about to cost him a very uncomfortable meeting with legal. Boots. Renata's jaw tightened. Camille, I am telling you for the last, and I am telling you for the last time, Camille said, that his ticket is valid. Boots. This removal is not authorized by the correct authority, and if you proceed, you will be the one explaining it afterward. Boots. Bradford made a sound of exasperation from the aisle. Renata, control your crew. The words landed wrong. Landed wrong for Desmond, who wrote them down. Boots. Landed wrong for Walter, who hadn't picked his magazine back up. Landed wrong for Selena, whose viewer count now read 7,400. Boots. And they landed wrong in a specific and clarifying way for Elijah Cross. He looked at the hand still resting on his shoulder. Boots. Looked at Renata. Looked at Bradford. Then, quietly enough that only Grant could hear it. You have exactly one chance to remove your hand from my shoulder before this becomes a matter for federal authorities. Boots. I am telling you calmly. I am telling you once. I will not repeat it. Grant removed his hand. He didn't step back. Boots. He held his position, but the hand came off, and the air in the cabin shifted by something you could almost measure. Boots. Renata took the opening. She straightened, reasserting her voice. Mr. Cross, I'm going to give you one final chance to resolve this peacefully. Boots. If you don't vacate seat 2A in the next 30 seconds, I'll have this aircraft returned to the gate. You will be placed on a no-fly list pending investigation, and this delay will be documented as a passenger disturbance. Boots. A pause. Investigation into what, exactly? Elijah said. Renata didn't answer. The question hung there, unanswerable, because there was nothing to answer. No conduct on Elijah's part that could be described, no disturbance that could be documented, no rule broken, no threshold crossed. Boots. Nothing at all, except his presence in a seat and his refusal to leave it. That fact was now visible to everyone in the cabin paying attention. Boots. Which was everyone. Walter set his aviation magazine on the empty seat beside him. He wasn't reading it anymore. He was watching. Boots. Elijah reached into his hoodie pocket, typed 3 words to Priya. Protocol Sigma. Now the reply came back in 9 seconds. Boots. Ready. Devon on standby. Say the word. Elijah typed back. Give me 3 minutes. He put the phone away, hands flat on the armrests. Boots. He breathed slowly, looking at the middle distance, and thought about Dallas. About a younger version of himself, tireder and less certain, standing in a boarding line with a thrift store blazer he'd ironed 3 times before a flight, believing then that the right clothes might keep the right ticket from being questioned. Boots. He thought about the thing he'd decided on that flight he would never do again. He thought about 3 minutes. Boots. He had waited 17 years. He could wait 3 more. Desmond stood up from his seat slowly, the way a man stands when he's finished thinking. Boots. He tucked his notebook away, looked at Renata, at Grant, at Bradford standing in the aisle, and spoke in the unhurried tone of someone who spent a career, making sure his words get quoted accurately. Boots. I'm a journalist. I've been sitting here for about 12 minutes. I want to ask one question for the record. Boots. A pause. Has anyone in this cabin actually verified, not assumed, verified that this man's ticket is invalid? Boots. Because I saw his boarding pass before it went into that pocket, and it had his name, this seat number, and today's date. Boots. So I'd like someone to explain what the discrepancy actually is. Bradford turned toward him. This doesn't involve you. I'm a passenger, Desmond said. Boots. It involves me, and I have a platform. Bradford's eyes moved to Selena's phone, to the small, steady red light of her camera. Boots. He looked at how many phones were now angled toward row 2, in various states of visibility. He made a calculation, and then, with the particular stubbornness of a man who has never fully learned that some situations can't be dominated into submission, he decided to push harder instead of stopping. Boots. This man, Bradford started, gesturing at Elijah, has been causing a disruption since. I have not said one word to you since you asked me to move, Elijah said. Boots. He didn't raise his voice. I have not moved, I have not raised my voice, I have not touched anything or anyone. Boots. I have sat in my seat, a pause exactly 2 seconds long. The disruption you're describing is my existence in a seat you wanted. Boots. The cabin absorbed that in silence. Walter let out a long, quiet breath, and then from seat 2B, The seat directly beside the one Elijah had been sitting in for the entire encounter. Yasmin Reyes stood up. Boots. It was so unexpected that Bradford actually turned to look at her. The expression of a man discovering the ground has shifted beneath him. Boots. She was looking at Renata, not at Bradford, at Renata. "I need to say something," Yasmin said. Her voice was controlled, but the control looked effortful. Boots. "Yasmin." Bradford said one word, a warning. She didn't sit down. "Before we boarded, Bradford told me that if seat 2A was already occupied when we got here, I should let the crew know we needed it handled." Boots. She paused. Those were his words, handled. I didn't ask what he meant. I should have. I knew what it meant. Boots. The silence that followed was total. Selena's stream, 7,400 viewers, the chat moving too fast to read. Boots. "I should have said something the moment this started," Yasmin continued. "I didn't. I looked out the window instead." She looked at Elijah directly for the first time since boarding. Boots. "I'm sorry for that." Bradford took a step toward her. "Yasmin, you don't understand what you're. I understand exactly what I'm doing." Boots. She sat back down, not in the aisle, in her own seat, and buckled her belt with the deliberateness of someone stating, through the action itself, that she was done going wherever Bradford Kane was going. Boots. The cabin processed her words the way confessions get processed in public. Not with noise, but with a kind of collective settling, a small adjustment of posture in every row, as people quietly updated what they thought they'd been watching. Boots. Walter cleared his throat, 57 years old, and he had the look of a man about to say something he'd been carrying a long time. Not just on this flight, but for years. Boots. "I've been flying long haul for 30-some years," he said, to the cabin, or maybe to himself. "I've seen things like this happen before." Boots. "And every single time I've told myself it wasn't my place." He looked at Elijah. "I watched this start 10 minutes ago." Boots. "I put my magazine down. A pause, and then I picked it back up, because that's what I always do." Boots. Another pause. "I'm not picking it back up." He looked at Renata. "That man has a valid ticket. He has been sitting quietly in his seat." Boots. "What's happened in this cabin tonight is not a seating discrepancy. It is not a disturbance caused by the passenger." Boots. "It's something I should have named 10 minutes ago, and I didn't, and I'm sorry for that." He looked back at Elijah. Boots. Elijah looked at him for a moment, then gave the smallest nod. Not performance, not forgiveness on display. Just acknowledgement, a recognition that saying it had cost something. Boots. Selena's count, 12,000. Elijah's phone buzzed once. "Priya, Devon Holding. Ready when you are." Boots. Elijah looked around the cabin, at Camille by the galley, Desmond with his notebook and phone, Walter with the magazine finally set aside for good, Yasmin buckled into her seat staring at her own hands, Selena with her camera steady after 11 straight minutes. Boots. His 3 minutes were up. He reached for his phone. The cabin fell into a different kind of silence now. Not an absence of noise, but an excess of honesty. Boots. The silence of a room full of people processing something they can't unprocess. Renata stood at the bulkhead, hands at her sides, working to keep her face composed. Boots. Grant had stepped back from row 2 and was standing near the curtain, and his position, which 10 minutes ago had been a statement, was quietly becoming something else. Boots. Witness. Bradford had gone silent, which was in itself notable. Elijah closed his eyes, not giving up, not because the weight of the last 14 minutes had gotten to him, but because he needed one private moment with a memory that had never fully left him. Boots. A memory that explained, more than any argument could, why he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Boots. He was 26 again, in a boarding line in Dallas, a thrift store blazer ironed 3 times, a business class ticket bought with every dollar he had, walking toward a gate for the first time in his life, without an argument to make about why he belonged there. Boots. He'd just closed his first deal. Not large by the standards he'd eventually operate at. 1.8 million, a partial buyout of a struggling logistics company he'd found, researched, modeled, and pitched himself in the 18 months after finishing his MBA. Boots. But it was real. It was his. He bought the business class seat because for the first time in his life he could. Boots. He walked down the jet bridge feeling, for the first time, like someone whose presence in a room wasn't an argument he had to make. Boots. A flight attendant appeared at his elbow. "Sir, I just need to take a look at your boarding pass." He handed it over. Boots. She looked at it, looked at him, held it up, as if the light might reveal something, called a colleague over. Boots. A quiet exchange, turned slightly away so he couldn't quite hear it. The colleague looked at the pass, looked at him, looked at the seat behind him. Boots. It's valid, the colleague said. I know, the first one said. I just wanted to be sure. She handed it back. Boots. Of course, sir. Right this way. No apology. No explanation of what, exactly, she'd needed to be sure of. He sat down. Boots. Buckled in. Looked out the window at the tarmac and felt something underneath the relief of the valid ticket. Something quieter than anger and more specific than sadness. The sting of being correct and still being checked. Boots. Of arriving with every credential in order and still being made to wait while two people decided, in a lowered voice, whether his credentials were real. Boots. He'd done everything right. He was still being asked to prove it. He spent the first hour of that flight looking out the window without seeing anything. Boots. He spent the second hour deciding two things, with the specific permanence of a man who's been changed rather than just affected. Boots. First, he would never again dress to manage other people's comfort with his presence. He'd watched people do that arithmetic his whole life, the slight formalization, the "this will help them take me seriously" calculation. And he'd done it himself, and it hadn't worked, because the thing being measured was never the clothing. Boots. He would wear what he wanted. The blazer would go in the closet and stay there. Second, he would build something so large that the question of whether he belonged in a room would stop requiring an argument at all. Boots. Not impossible. He knew it would never be impossible, but answerable, immediately, without lowered voices and second opinions. Boots. He didn't know on that flight that the answer would take 17 years and $6.1 billion to build. Boots. He just knew the meeting in Chicago had gone well. Better than well. That memory had never actually left him. Boots. It had settled into the foundation under everything, quiet, load-bearing, and now, sitting in seat 2A with a confiscated boarding pass, a hand that had been on his shoulder without permission, and an entire aircraft that had just been told over the PA he was a problem. Elijah Cross felt that old sting return. Boots. Not sharper, not louder, exactly the same, as if 17 years hadn't passed at all in the specific place where dignity gets questioned. Boots. As if the only thing that had changed was the size of the answer he was now carrying. He opened his eyes. Boots. The cabin was still. Bradford had finally sat down across the aisle, briefcase on his lap, his expression shifting in the last few minutes from entitlement towards something more calculating. Boots. A man who understood risk, starting to understand his exposure. Elijah looked at his phone. Priya's last message glowed, ready. Boots. Devon Holding. Say the word. He'd told her 3 minutes. 2 minutes 41 had passed. He thought about what the next handful of seconds needed to contain. Boots. He needed the record to be complete. Not a misunderstanding that could be softened in a press release. Not a he said, she said erased by an apology and a voucher. Boots. He needed the whole thing standing in plain sight. The PA announcement, the confiscated pass, the hand on his shoulder, Bradford's 4 words. All of it caught on a live stream now pushing 12,000 viewers. Boots. He looked at the number on Selena's screen, and something crossed his mind that wasn't satisfaction and wasn't triumph. Something closer to clarity. Boots. The record is complete. He took the phone out of his pocket, dialed, pressed speaker and held it up, not for theater, just positioned so the people who needed to hear it would. Boots. Priya, he said in the voice he used in boardrooms, which was just his voice. Level, specific, carrying weight the way a building carries weight, from the foundation up. Boots. Activate Protocol Sigma. Connect me to Chairman Okafor. Board line. Priya's voice came through immediately, already dialing, Mr. Cross. Devon is holding. Boots. Renata's eyes went to the phone in Elijah's hand. For the first time in the entire encounter, something moved across her face that wasn't calculation, wasn't authority, wasn't the management of a situation. Boots. Something closer to the look a person gets when they realize the ground has been shifting under them for a while. And they're only now feeling it. Boots. He hadn't been stalling. He'd been choosing the exact moment. Elijah Cross had learned a long time ago that the right moment, the one where truth lands with enough weight to actually stick, was always worth waiting for. Boots. The call connected. Devon Okafor picked up on the second ring. Devon Okafor, 60 chairman of Meridian Air's board, had been at a fundraising dinner in a Chicago hotel ballroom when the secure board line rang with the specific code that meant this was not routine. Boots. He'd excused himself quietly and now stood in a corridor, one hand in his pocket, a string quartet audible through the closed ballroom doors behind him. Boots, Elijah. His voice was measured. He'd known Elijah Cross for 5 years and could hear, from the specific flatness in his voice, that something was wrong. Boots, Devon. Elijah's voice was calm, the calm of still water, which is different from the calm of undisturbed water, because still water might be covering something, and undisturbed water has nothing beneath it at all. Boots, I'm going to explain what's happened on your aircraft in the last 14 minutes, and I'm going to explain it once. Boots, listen without speaking until I'm finished. I'm listening, Elijah explained. Precise, like a man giving a deposition. Dates, times, names where he had them, exact language where he remembered it. Boots, Flight 447, Gate 22, Newark to Chicago. Seat 2A, paid in full, confirmed on the manifest. A Meridian Platinum member named Bradford Kane, Senior VP at Halloran Industries, told him to move because of the way he looked. Boots, the lead flight attendant made a public PA announcement, implying he was a discrepancy, while holding his boarding pass in her jacket pocket. Boots, a security contractor placed his hand on his shoulder after being explicitly, calmly told not to. And your co-pilot, Elijah said, without emphasis, because none was needed, authorized a removal order without ever leaving the cockpit to verify a single fact about what was actually happening in this cabin. Boots. Then he said the thing that changed Devon Okafor's expression, not dramatically, with the specific shift of a man hearing a number he cannot ignore. Boots. I'm flying to Chicago to sign the acquisition agreement, Devon. The one you've been working toward for 16 months. The one your quarterly report depends on. Boots. The one keeping Meridian solvent through the end of the year. A pause. Your crew just tried to remove the man coming to save your airline. Boots. The string quartet kept playing behind the closed doors. Devon Okafor stood very still for a moment that felt longer than it was. Boots. In the cabin, the call was on speaker. Every word carried through the first-class section. Renata had gone very still. Boots. Grant had taken a step backward without appearing to notice he'd done it. Bradford, in the seat across the aisle, watched the phone in Elijah's hand with an expression that had completed its journey from entitlement to calculation to something bordering on dread. Boots, Elijah. Devon's voice had lost its earlier measure. Not panic, he was too experienced for panic, but the rapid reorganizing of a man realigning his understanding of a situation while the situation is still moving. Boots. Tell me what you need. 4 things, Elijah said. First, a hold order to the gate. This plane does not push back. Boots. Second, a call to the station director at O'Hare, to Gate 22, immediately. Third, the crew manifest for this flight, pulled and logged with the timestamp of this conversation. Boots. A half-second pause. Fourth, I want to handle the rest myself, in person, on board, done. Devon's voice was already moving. Boots. I'm calling the tower right now. And Elijah. A pause, the pause of a man choosing his words carefully, aware he's earned the right to be careful and very little else. Boots. I am deeply sorry. There's nothing I can say that's adequate to what you just described, and I know that, and I'm saying it anyway. Boots. I'll accept it tomorrow morning, Elijah said. Right now I need the hold order. You have it. 30 seconds. Elijah ended the call. Boots set the phone on his knee, looked at Renata. The silence in the cabin now had a different texture than any silence before it. Not shock, not embarrassment, not the choosing not to react of the early minutes. Boots. This was the silence of comprehension, a room full of people who had just heard, over a phone speaker held by a man in a hoodie, the chairman of the board confirm with his own voice that the man in seat 2A was exactly who the seat said he was, and considerably more. Boots. Selena's viewer count, 18,500. Overhead, the intercom clicked on. Not Renata this time. The gate side, terminal system, the gate agent's voice. Boots. Meridian Air Flight 447, this is a hold notification from operations. Flight 447, do not push back. Repeat, do not push back. Boots. Stand by for instructions from the chairman's office. The words came through the cockpit and the cabin PA at the same time. Boots. Captain Whitfield in the cockpit heard his own aircraft placed on hold by the chairman of his own airline for the first time in a 30-year career. Boots. He set down his checklist and looked at his co-pilot, Marcus Delgado, the one who'd authorized the removal without leaving the cockpit, said nothing. Boots. He stared at his instruments with the focused intensity of a man thinking very hard about something that had nothing to do with the instruments. Boots. In the cabin, Renata heard the words chairman's office and understood. In the complete and specific way people understand things once there's no longer any way not to, that the last 14 minutes had not been what she thought they were. Boots. Elijah Cross stood up from seat 2A for the first time. He stood the way he always stood. No ceremony, no throat clearing, no shifting of weight to signal he was about to speak. Boots. He simply stood and the room prepared itself. 6'1", the hoodie, the joggers, the sneakers with no logo, exactly what they'd always been. Boots. His clothes, his choice, his refusal to dress for anyone else's comfort. A carry-on in the overhead bin, a phone in his pocket, and 17 years of building something large enough to answer a question, first asked on a flight to Chicago when he was 26 years old. Boots. He looked at the cabin, the way someone looks at a room they've been watching carefully for a long time. Boots. He started with Renata. My name is Elijah Cross. I'm managing partner of Ironbridge Capital. He didn't raise his voice. Boots. Didn't project. Just spoke at the level of a man in a room, addressing the room, because that's what he was. Boots. I'm on this flight because I have a meeting in Chicago tomorrow morning to sign a $4.6 billion rescue agreement with Meridian Air. Boots. An agreement that, if completed, stabilizes this company's debt and funds the expansion your chairman has spent 16 months negotiating. Boots. He let it sit. I am, in a very specific and non-metaphorical sense, the person coming to save this airline. Boots. The cabin took that in, with the particular attention of people who have just watched the frame of everything they were witnessing get rearranged around them. Boots. He turned to Bradford. The man standing there, he said it flat, a fact, not a judgment, is Bradford Kane. Boots. Senior VP at Halloran Industries, one of the companies I was considering as a minority partner in this deal. A pause. Boots was considering. Bradford didn't move. His briefcase sat on his lap, his hands very still. Mr. Kane told this crew he didn't feel safe, Elijah said. Boots. I hadn't spoken to him. I hadn't looked at him. I hadn't moved from this seat. The threat he described was a black man in a hoodie in a first-class seat who didn't stand up when told to. Boots. He looked at Bradford steadily. That was the safety concern. He turned to Renata. You asked me 3 times to give up a seat I paid $12,000 for. Boots. You confiscated my boarding pass, my property, with no legal authority to do so. You made a public announcement over this aircraft's intercom, describing me as a seating discrepancy before verifying a single fact. Boots. He wasn't angry, wasn't raising his voice. The absence of anger was, somehow, the most devastating thing about it. You framed me as a problem to every person on this aircraft. Boots. He turned to Grant. You were called into this cabin and put your hand on my shoulder, without asking a single question about who I was, what I'd done, or whether the situation you'd been sent to handle was what it looked like. Boots. I told you to remove your hand. You didn't, not immediately. A pause. That's the extent of what you knew about me. Boots. You acted on everything else. He looked out at the full cabin now. Not at any one face, all of it. Boots. None of this happened because I was loud. None of it happened because I caused a disruption. It happened because a man in a tailored suit looked at a black man in a hoodie and decided, with no other information, that he was in the wrong place. Boots. He looked at Renata, at Grant, at the cockpit door, and the people whose job it was to prevent that didn't. Boots. They participated in it. He stopped. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of truth said clearly, in front of enough witnesses that it no longer needed defending. Boots. Selena didn't lower her phone. Desmond's pen was in his hand, but he wasn't writing, just watching. Walter looked at Elijah with an expression people sometimes get near clarity. Not awe exactly, something adjacent. Boots. Camille, at the curtain, had her hands loose at her sides, and her eyes, which had been holding so much for so long, were bright. Boots. Then Elijah did something no one expected. He looked at Yasmin. You told the truth, he said, in a room full of people who'd decided not to. Boots. I want you to know I heard it. Yasmin looked at her hands, then up. It was the least I could have done. Boots. It was also the least I did for too long. Still something, Elijah said. In rooms like this one, something matters. Boots. He looked at Camille. And you. Twice you told her my ticket was valid. Twice you stepped up when you could have stayed behind the curtain. Boots. You were told to go back. You didn't go back. Camille nodded, small, careful, the nod of someone trying not to let a moment get bigger than it needs to be. Boots. What's your name? Camille Duarte. Camille Duarte. Elijah repeated, the way you repeat a name you intend to remember. You did the right thing. Boots. He looked last at Walter. And you. A pause. You put the magazine down. Eventually. Walter let out something that was almost a laugh, quieter and more genuine than a laugh, the sound of a man being seen accurately. Boots. Later than I should have. Late enough to matter, Elijah said. Which is different from too late. He reached into his pocket, glanced at his phone, then looked back at the cabin, at the seat he'd been sitting in for the entire ordeal, the seat that had become the center of gravity for the last 15 minutes. Boots. He sat back down, not defiantly, not symbolically, because it was his seat and he had a flight to finish and a deal to sign in the morning. Boots. He put his headphones back over his ears, but before he closed his eyes, he looked at Renata once more. Boots. I'm going to give you the chance to do one thing before this plane goes back to the gate, he said. Quiet now. The quietest he'd been all night. Boots. Walk over here and return my boarding pass. That's all I need from you right now. Renata crossed the cabin. Boots. Reached into her jacket pocket. Held it out. Elijah took it. Said nothing else. Slid it back into his hoodie pocket where it belonged, where it had been when he boarded, and closed his eyes, for the first time since Bradford Kane walked down the jet bridge and pointed a finger at him, without anything pressing on them. Boots. Bradford Kane had survived 22 years in senior corporate roles by knowing when to fight and when to reframe. Fight when you have leverage, when the room's on your side, when the facts can be bent to favor you. Boots. Reframe when none of that's true anymore, when the situation has passed the point of winning and the only remaining job is limiting the damage. Boots. He understood the calculus. He'd used it 100 times. He'd walked out of collapsing rooms and called it strategic timing. Boots. What he hadn't yet understood, what he was about to learn, was that the window for reframing had already closed. Boots. He stood up from the seat across the aisle. Elijah. The name came out with the specific warmth men like Bradford reserve for moments they've decided warmth might be useful. Boots. Listen, this has obviously gotten out of hand. I didn't know who you were. None of us did. If I had... Boots. If you had, Elijah said, eyes still closed, you'd have let me sit in my seat. Bradford paused. Right, yes. Boots. Exactly. So let's start over. Let's be professional about this. And you said, Elijah said, opening his eyes now, looking at Bradford with an expression so specific and so still that Bradford stopped talking mid-sentence, just drag him out if he won't walk. Boots. He let that sit for 1 second. Those were your words. I want everyone in this cabin to hear them from your mouth, not from a recording. Boots. He glanced toward Desmond.
Did you get it word for word?
Time-stamped, Desmond said. Bradford looked at Selena's phone, at Desmond's notebook. Boots. At the other passengers now, to varying degrees, oriented toward him with the attention of people who've been watching a story, and just reached the part where the verdict lands. Boots. That comment was as frustrated. It was heat of the moment. I didn't mean for it to Bradford. Boots. Elijah's voice was as flat and final as a door closing. Your company is asking Ironbridge for $380 million to avoid a liquidity event by end of quarter. Boots. I know your financials. I've read your filings. You flew to Chicago to meet me because without this deal, Halloran Industries is in serious trouble by fall. Boots. A pause. You spent the last 16 minutes trying to have me removed from a seat so you could take it, in front of a journalist, a live-streaming content creator, 10 other witnesses, and my executive assistant currently monitoring this call from the ground. Boots. He looked at Bradford with the specific directness of a man who's decided the sentence is finished. I'll take the meeting tomorrow. Boots. But Halloran is no longer under consideration as a partner in this deal, and the reason will be fully documented in the due diligence file, which is a matter of record. Boots. Bradford looked like a man who believed the ground under him was solid and just heard it crack. Elijah, Boots. I'm done talking to you, Bradford. Elijah closed his eyes again. Bradford stood in the aisle a moment too long, the moment of a man who hasn't decided which direction to move, because every direction has become equally bad. Boots. Then, with the stiff deliberateness of someone performing composure they don't actually feel, he picked his briefcase up off the seat. Boots. He looked at Yasmin, she looked back, then away. He gathered himself and walked up the aisle. Past Selena's phone, still tracking. Boots. Past Desmond, who made a small note without looking up. He reached the front of the cabin and stopped. Boots. The door was sealed. The aircraft had been placed on hold but hadn't returned to the gate yet. and he stood there with nowhere to go, which was, in its own way, an answer to the question of where a man like Bradford Kane ends up once the machinery of everyone else's deference finally breaks down. Boots. The cabin waited. Selina whispered into her mic. He's standing at the front of the plane. He has nowhere to go. Boots. The man he tried to have removed is sitting a seat with his eyes closed, and the chairman of the airline just called to apologize. Boots. She paused. Viewer count, 26,000. Desmond wrote a single line at the bottom of his notes and drew a box around it. The most powerful person on this aircraft never raised his voice once. Boots. And from somewhere in the middle of the cabin, a sound started that wasn't applause. Not the full, organized applause of a theater, the softer, more uncertain kind that happens in small spaces when people are moved and aren't sure what moving requires of them. Boots. 2 passengers in rows 4 and 5 started it. A woman in row 3 joined. It spread through first class with the tentativeness of something true that people had finally decided to acknowledge out loud. Boots. Elijah Cross sat in seat 2A and didn't perform humility, didn't perform grace, didn't open his eyes to acknowledge it. Boots. He simply received it, the way a man receives something that confirms what he already knew. Quietly, the relief of someone glad the world had finally caught up. Boots. Gate 22 came back into view through the forward windows with the finality of something already decided. The jet bridge connected with a heavy thud. Boots. The door lock clicked open, the sound every frequent flyer knows, the sound that means the outside world is about to come back in. Boots. Selina's stream, 34,000 viewers. The clip had already been shared across 3 platforms by accounts she didn't recognize. Desmond's thread, posted from the aircraft before the hold order even came through, had already been quoted by journalists in 2 time zones. Boots. The door opened, and Priya Malhotra herself walked in, Meridian's most senior station director in the building, the person Devon Okafor had called first after the tower. Boots. Mid-40s, the calm, unhurried bearing of someone who'd handled crises in jet bridges before, and stopped being surprised by what people did to each other in first class a long time ago. Boots. Behind her, 2 uniformed officers. Actual police, not contractors. The flat, procedural posture of people there to enforce accountability, not project dominance. Boots. Priya walked to the center of the cabin, looked at Renata, at Grant at Bradford, still frozen near the front. Boots. At Elijah, seated, hands on the armrests, hoodie unmoved. Mr. Cross. Her voice carried without effort. On behalf of Meridian Air, I am deeply and genuinely sorry for what happened on this aircraft tonight. Boots. I appreciate that, Elijah said. I need action, not apology. You'll have both. She turned to Renata. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation. Boots. Surrender your badge and your device. Renata Ford had spent 17 years assembling the professional armor flight attendants learned to wear. The smile, the posture, the voice that manages without appearing to manage. Boots. She'd worn it through delayed flights and medical emergencies, and passengers who said terrible things. She'd been good at it, in ways that had nothing to do with the last hour, and everything to do with the 17 years before it. Boots. She hadn't imagined this. You generally don't imagine the version of events where you're wrong. You imagine the version where you were justified, or at least defensible. Boots. You imagine the press statement, the HR conversation you'll get to shape, the misunderstanding you'll get to clarify in a private meeting. Boots. You don't imagine the station director saying your name in front of a full cabin, and 2 police officers, and a live stream with 34,000 viewers. Boots. Renata unpinned her badge, held it a moment, handed it over. Your device as well, Priya said. Renata handed over the tablet that held her notes, the intercom announcement, the log describing a seating discrepancy that would not survive contact with Selina's recording. Boots. Priya turned to Grant. You're to disembark immediately. Your company will receive formal notice tonight. You are not to return to this gate. Boots. Grant opened his mouth, closed it, made the calculation that talking wouldn't help. He looked at Elijah for half a second, an expression that wasn't quite apologetic and wasn't quite defiant, and landed somewhere in the territory of a man realizing fully that he made a choice, and the choice was finished. Boots. He walked up the aisle, past Selina's camera, past Desmond's notebook, and through the door without looking back. From the cockpit corridor, Captain Whitfield emerged. Boots. Silver-haired, the bearing of a man who'd flown long-haul for 3 decades and never once been the subject of a mid-gate investigation. Boots. He walked to the center of the cabin. Mr. Cross. His voice was steady. I authorized this removal order based on information from my crew, without stepping out of the cockpit to assess the situation myself. Boots. That was a failure of my responsibility as captain of this aircraft. I'm sorry. Elijah looked at him a moment. Boots. I accept that. I'd like you to fly us to Chicago. Of course. Marcus Delgado, the co-pilot, stood at the edge of the galley, looking at the floor in the particular way of someone arriving at an accounting in real time. Boots. Marcus, Priya said, you'll be subject to a formal conduct review. You'll finish this flight, and we'll handle the rest through proper channels. Boots. Her voice held the neutrality of institutional authority, not cruelty, not anger, just consequence. He nodded once and returned to the cockpit without speaking. Boots. Priya turned to Bradford. Mr. Kane, you are not a crew member, and the events involving you are a matter between you and Mr. Boots. Cross. But you'll need to be reseated before we can depart. Seat 5A in business class window. I'm in first class, Bradford said. Boots. The words came out with the automatic authority of old habit, but they sounded smaller now, like the echo of something that used to work. Boots. You were, Priya said. Seat 2B is now reserved for airline use, business class, seat 5A. Bradford looked at Elijah, who sat with his hands on the armrests, eyes forward, giving him nothing. Boots. No signal of an overreaction, no room for renegotiation. He picked up his briefcase and walked the length of the first-class cabin, past Walter, who watched him pass in a silence louder than words. Boots. Past Selena, who lowered her phone as he went by. Not a courtesy, just because she already had what she needed. Boots. Past Desmond, who didn't look up. He passed through the curtain into business class, and it fell closed behind him. Boots. The cabin exhaled. Priya turned back to the remaining passengers and crew. We'll be departing for Chicago in approximately 20 minutes. Boots. I want to personally thank the passengers in this cabin for your patience and your conduct. She looked at Selena. Boots. At Desmond, at Walter, all of you. Elijah didn't let Bradford disappear through that curtain without one last conversation. Not because he needed it. He'd already said everything that needed saying in front of everyone who needed to hear it. Boots. He stopped him with a single word. His name. Bradford turned around. Because whatever he'd lost in the last 40 minutes, the reflex that made him respond to people holding his future hadn't gone with it. Boots. The meeting's still on, Elijah said. Bradford blinked. Chicago, tomorrow, the acquisition talk. Elijah looked at him the way he looked at everything, directly, without ornament. Boots. The meeting's on. Something crossed Bradford's face that was almost relief. The reaching toward the rope relief of a drowning man who sees something to grab. Boots. Thank you. Elijah, I genuinely didn't understand what The meeting's on, Elijah said again, and the terms have changed. Boots. The relief receded. Halloran Industries is removed from consideration as a partner in this acquisition. Your equity stake, your board seat, your co-branding rights, all of it is off the table. Boots. What remains is a separate question. Whether Ironbridge is willing to consider any relationship with Halloran going forward in any capacity, subject to a full internal review of your conduct and your company's practices. Boots. He paused. My team's already been briefed. Elijah, Bradford said, and now his voice had stripped down to something with no registers left. Boots. My company has 4,000 employees. If this deal falls apart, people lose their jobs. People who had nothing to do with tonight. Boots. I know, Elijah said, which is why the meeting's still on. I'm not abandoning 4,000 people because of you. Boots. I'm separating 4,000 people from you. That's a different thing. He looked at Bradford with the complete steadiness of someone who'd already finished making the decision. Boots. Come to Chicago. Make your case without the seat you wanted. Show me your company without you sitting in it. Boots. If it's worth saving, I'll find a way. If it isn't, that'll be obvious. Bradford stood there a moment with his briefcase and his wrinkled certainty, and the understanding that he'd been handed something he hadn't earned by someone he'd treated as less than nothing. Boots. He nodded once. He had that much self-awareness left. He turned toward the curtain. Bradford. He turned back. When you get to Chicago, Elijah said, you're going to be sitting across from the same man you tried to have dragged off this plane tonight. Boots. I need you to understand that. Same person, same chair, same red on your judgment. Bradford held the look for 2 seconds. Boots. I understand. Good, Elijah said. Then we have a starting point. Bradford went through the curtain. Isabel, no, Yasmin, hadn't moved from her seat. Boots. Still belted in, toed at her feet, hands folded on the tray table. She'd watched all of it. The station director's arrival, the conversations, Bradford's exit, the way someone watches something they're both part of and separate from. Boots. Complicit and aware of it, and not yet sure what the awareness required of her. She looked at Elijah. He looked back. Boots. You told the truth, he said, in front of a room where telling it was the harder thing. I told it about 6 minutes too late. Boots. 6 minutes is the gap between the moment it starts and the moment you decide to stop going along with it, Elijah said. Boots. That gap shrinks the more times you notice it and close it early. A pause. Most people never close it at all. Boots. She nodded. She wasn't looking for absolution. She knew the difference between what she'd done and what it had cost her to finally do it. And the accounting was her own to keep. Boots. Are you continuing to Chicago? Elijah asked. Yes, I have business there. My own. Good, Elijah said, looking toward the front of the cabin. Boots. So do I. And from somewhere, not started by Selena, not by Desmond, but from the older man in 2C, Walter Higgins unfolded his hands from his lap and brought his palms together once. Boots. Twice. A third time, a small, quiet, genuine sound. One by one, the other passengers joined it. Not wild, not performance applause. Boots. The kind that happens when something true has finished happening, and the people who watched it want to mark the completion with something physical. Boots. We saw this. We were here. It happened. Elijah Cross sat in seat 2A and received it. No bow, no wave. The way a building receives the weight it was built to carry. Boots. Without strain. Because that's what it was built for. 20 minutes before the new departure time, the forward cabin had shifted from courtroom into something quieter and more complicated, the atmosphere that follows resolution without being resolution itself. Boots. The place where people sit with what they've witnessed and start the slow work of understanding what it means. Camille had gone back to her duties. Not Renata's duties. Renata was gone. The duties of the flight itself. Boots. She moved through the rows with the specific efficiency of someone running on adrenaline who hasn't yet had a moment to feel what that adrenaline was protecting her from. Boots. She came to row 2. Can I get you anything, Mr. Cross? The question was professional. The eyes were something else, someone who wanted to say more and wasn't sure the moment allowed it. Boots. Water, please, Elijah said. Then sit down for a minute. She glanced around. Reflex, the reflex of a junior employee checking whether she's allowed. Boots. Please, Elijah said. She sat in the empty seat across the aisle. The seat that had, at various points in the last hour, held a briefcase and a confession, and the entire weight of what this flight had almost become. Boots. How are you doing? Elijah asked. The simplicity of the question caught her off guard, the way simple things do when you've been braced for something complicated. Boots. She thought about a professional answer, gave a real one instead. Honestly, I'm shaking. I've been shaking for 20 minutes. Boots. I just wasn't going to let anyone see it. That's what courage is, Elijah said, not the absence of shaking. Boots. The decision to move anyway. Camille looked at her hands, which were in fact not entirely steady. I was scared I'd lose my job. Boots. Renata has a lot of pull with scheduling. She's been doing this 15 years. I've been doing it too. When she looked at me and said the galley, now. I know what that look means. Boots. But you didn't go. No, I didn't go. A pause. Can I ask you something? When it was happening, when he had his hand on your shoulder, when she said the no-fly list, all of it, were you scared? Boots. Elijah considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. No, he said. Not the way you mean. I was angry. Boots. Not the kind that makes you loud, the kind that makes you very quiet and very clear, and I was tired. Boots. A pause. Tired of that specific situation, the one where you're waiting for the world to catch up to something you already know about yourself. Boots. Another pause. But scared? No, I had what I needed. I'd already won. I just needed to let it arrive. Boots. Camille turned that over slowly. You knew the whole time you'd be okay. I knew the truth was complete, Elijah said. Boots. Being okay is sometimes a different timeline than the truth being complete. But yes, I knew. She was quiet a moment. Boots. I didn't know if I was going to be okay. I still don't entirely. You will be, Elijah said, with the specific certainty of a man who's already taken action to make sure of it. Boots. I wasn't being performative on that call. The letter's going in your file tonight. The acquisition agreement will include a protection clause for employees who acted with integrity during this incident. Boots. That's not a favor. That's a condition. Camille absorbed that. The shaking had settled some. Why? You don't know me. Boots. I know what you did, Elijah said. And I know what it costs to do it. That's enough. She stood slowly, the way people stand when they've been handed something they're still figuring out how to carry. Boots. Thank you, she said. You did it, Elijah said. I just showed up. She went back to her duties. Her hands were steadier. Boots. Walter had been listening from 2C with the specific attention of someone who'd decided listening mattered more than looking busy. Boots. He looked at Elijah. Can I say something, please? Walter sat with the words a moment, assembling them carefully, not a man who spoke without thinking, and fully aware he was about to say something in public that couldn't be taken back. Boots. I've been on long-haul flights since the 80s, he said. I've watched things happen, not always this exact thing, but things in the same family. Boots. Same shape, same logic. He paused. And I've always told myself it wasn't my business, that someone else would say something. Boots. That I didn't know the whole story, that it would resolve itself. He looked at the aisle where Bradford had stood, at the spot where Renata had stood, at the seat Elijah had sat in for the last 2 hours. Boots. It didn't resolve itself. People resolved it. Camille resolved part of it. You resolved most of it. And I sat in 2C and picked up a magazine. Boots. He paused again. I'm 57. I have a daughter who's 24, and I'd like her to live in a world with fewer passengers who stay silent and more people like Camille Duarte. Boots. He looked at Elijah directly. I don't know what that costs me personally, but I'm going to start finding out, starting tonight. Boots. Elijah looked at him a moment, then said something he'd said only once before that night, to Camille. Thank you. Boots. Don't thank me, Walter said. I'm 30 years late. Just tell me how not to be late next time. Elijah thought about it. Boots. Look for the moment when you pick the magazine back up, he said. That's the moment. That's where the decision actually lives. Boots. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to put the magazine back down. Boots. Walter looked at the aviation magazine still sitting on the seat beside him. He picked it up, held it a second, and set it on the floor. Boots. The consequences came fast, and without much ceremony, the way consequences tend to when there's documented evidence and 34,000 witnesses. Boots. Renata Ford's suspension became a termination 72 hours later, after an internal investigation pulled 3 years of her conduct file. Boots. It turned up 4 prior incidents involving minority passengers that had been quietly marked, resolved, and closed without action. Not through conspiracy, but through the ordinary human preference for not making paperwork about your own colleagues. Boots. The difference this time was, there was no version of events without Selena Ruiz's camera. No, he said, she said, when 34,000 people had already heard exactly what was said. And by whom? Boots. Renata's 17 years didn't save her. They made the audit more thorough. Grant Holloway lost his Meridian contract within 48 hours, and 3 more airport security contracts within the week, as the companies holding them watched the clip and did the math on what association with the incident was going to cost them. Boots. A civil complaint was filed by Elijah's legal team, not for damages, he made that explicit, but to establish a formal record. Boots. It's settled, Grant's name is in it. Marcus Delgado underwent a formal conduct review and was reassigned to ground instruction for 6 months. Boots. He kept his license. He didn't keep the route. In a deposition later, he said he'd been wrong to act on a description instead of an observation, and that he'd known it was wrong when he did it, and did it anyway because it was faster. Boots. It was, in its own way, the most honest thing anyone said in the entire aftermath. Bradford Kane attended the Chicago meeting. Boots. He sat across the table from Elijah Cross for 4 hours. Boots. Elijah brought data instead of grievance, analysis instead of punishment, and at the end of the 4 hours presented a restructured arrangement. Ironbridge would provide Halloran Industries a smaller bridge loan. Not the partnership, not the equity stake Bradford had been counting on, with strict conditions attached around leadership review and conduct standards. Boots. It would save the company. It would not save Bradford's position inside it. Halloran's board, having watched the clip on every major platform and spent 72 hours absorbing the full financial and reputational fallout, voted to accept the terms. Boots. Bradford Kane resigned 6 days later, quietly, no parting package, a statement so brief it would have fit on an index card. Boots. The Meridian Air acquisition closed 60 days later. At Elijah's insistence, the final agreement included a provision that hadn't existed in the original draft. An independent passenger advocacy board, empowered to investigate discrimination complaints from Meridian passengers without routing them through the airline's own HR department. Boots. The board had authority over crew conduct records. Its findings were public. Elijah funded it personally for the first 3 years, then moved the funding into a trust built to outlast his involvement. Boots. Camille Duarte was promoted to senior flight attendant 4 months later. Not a gift from Elijah, who'd made sure of her protection, not her advancement. Boots. The promotion came from a new director of cabin services who read her file, read the letter Priya Malhotra had sent the night of the flight, and later called it the easiest personnel decision she'd made in 20 years. Boots. Selena Ruiz's footage got cited in journalism classes as an example of real-time citizen documentation. She kept making travel content. Boots. She kept pressing record when it mattered. Desmond Achebe wrote the full account for a national outlet 3 weeks after the flight. Boots. He sent Elijah a copy before it ran. Elijah read it, asked for 0 changes, and replied with 4 words: accurate. Boots. Thank you for getting it right. Walter Higgins called his daughter the night he landed and told her everything, what happened, and what he had and hadn't done. Boots. They talked for an hour. At the end of it, she said, "I'm glad you finally said something, Dad." He said, "I should have said it sooner." Boots. She said, "Yeah, but you said it." 6 weeks after the flight, Elijah Cross went back through O'Hare. He wore a hoodie. A different one, dark navy, almost black, but the same essential thing. Boots. Comfortable. Chosen, without a single reference to anyone else's comfort with his presence. White sneakers, no logo. The same worn leather carry-on. Boots. He looked, to anyone who didn't know, like a man with somewhere to be, dressed for the trip and not for an audience. Boots. The gate agent checked his boarding pass, looked at him, didn't hold it up to the light, didn't calculate a thing. Boots. Mr. Cross, seat 2A, have a good flight. He boarded, sat down. Nobody said a word to him, not because he had changed. Boots. He hadn't. He was the same man in the same kind of clothes, in the same seat he'd always belonged in. Boots. What had changed was a record, a file, a contract clause and a commendation letter and a formal proceeding, and 34,000 people who'd watched the truth make itself impossible to ignore. Boots. What had changed was one co-pilot who'd ask before authorizing next time, one gate agent who'd read the new training material. Boots. One airline with an independent board no internal department could quietly overrule. Small things. Boots. The kind of small things that add up, over time, into a world where the next person in a hoodie, the one without Elijah Cross's contacts, without his leverage, without 17 years of hard-won patience, has a slightly better chance of sitting in their own seat without having to prove they belong there. Boots. Elijah hadn't just protected his own seat that night. He'd made the seat, not this specific one, not 2A on Flight 447, but the seat every person has a right to occupy in a space they've paid for, in a room they're entitled to be in a world that doesn't always make that easy, a little more available for whoever came after him. Boots. Not because he was the perfect person to do it, because he was the one who was there, who refused to move. Boots. Who waited with total, patient certainty for the truth to arrive on its own schedule. And it did. It always does. Boots. Power doesn't always announce itself walking down the aisle. Sometimes it's sitting quietly in seat 2A, in a faded hoodie waiting for the world to catch up, because dignity was never something you earn by looking the part. Boots. It's something you carry into any room, in any clothes, at any altitude, and no one can take it from you. They can only reveal, by trying, exactly who they really are.